From London, this is the Orwellians podcast. I'm Roland Elliott Brown. My guest today is Marc Bennetts. Marc is a correspondent for The Times and Sunday Times. In 2022, he was forced to leave Russia because of wartime censorship laws and the threat of arrest. Marc's new book is The Descent, Witnessing Russia's Spiral into Madness under Putin. Marc, welcome.
Hello.
I want to go back to your early days in Russia. You went there in 1997, and so you were there at the end of the Yeltsin period, and there was an extremely significant murder in 1998 of the politician Galina Starovoitova, who was trying to pursue lustration in Russia, meaning that she was trying to pass legislation that would have made sure that KGB officers, Soviet-era human rights violators, would not get into office anytime soon. Tell us why that idea never gained traction in Russia, why it didn't prevent Putin, for example, from coming to office, and also how people reacted to her murder at the time.
But yeah, as you correctly pointed out, if Galina Starovoitova's law on lustration had come into force, then Putin, as an ex-KGB officer, would never have been able to enter politics, and the world, Russia and the world, would look very different today. She was killed in 1998, and she'd been trying for a number of years to get her law on lustration through, to no real success. One of the reasons was because there was kind of this fear that because the communist regime was so kind of deeply embedded into everyday life, that lots of people would kind of essentially be prevented from holding positions of power, including Yeltsin himself, who was also a Communist Party member, and he was worried that it would kind of undermine his own rule. When they asked Starovoitova about this, that it would just become a witch hunt, she said, "But do you want the witches to hunt us? Do you want the witches to hunt us?" Which is essentially what happened. Putin came to power, filled the security services and parliament and the Kremlin with ex-KGB guys, and we got what we got 22 years later, i.e. the war in Ukraine. She was killed in 1998 as she was arriving home at her apartment in St. Petersburg. At the time, of course, there was no suspicion that Putin was involved. But, he was head of the FSB. He'd recently been appointed the head of the FSB, the State Security Service. That there's never been any firm evidence that he ordered the murder, although Starovoitova's sister, Olga, said that it's not impossible that he knew about it because it was such a high-profile killing that in those kind of like very kind of chaotic criminal times in St. Petersburg in the late 1990s, she kind of thought it was slightly implausible that the head of the FSB wouldn't have known that someone was planning to kill her anyway. But she never directly accused Putin of being involved. And when she was murdered, it was one of the most kind of high-profile political murders ever in Russia. Although, kind of strangely, it was her legacy is still alive, but surprisingly, some Russians don't even know about her now, or didn't know about her anyway. The kind of opposition Russians started to reflect on what would have happened if she hadn't been killed and if her law and lustration had gone through, and we'd be seeing a very different Russia today. So it's kind of a very poignant moment in Russian history, and tragic moment in Russian history, of course.
Yeah. Do you remember what reactions were like at the time? Well, you probably remember your own reaction. Do you remember how it was covered in the press?
It was a long time ago, and to be completely honest with you, it was my first year in Russia, and it was. And while I remember reading the stories in the newspapers and reading reports in the Western press and seeing the crowds, at that point of my life in Russia, it didn't make a huge impression upon me. I mean, it was only actually when I left Russia after 2022, and I started thinking about her death and her life, that I realized what a massive moment it was. But I mean, I must confess, at the time, I mean, I'd arrived in Russia in 1997. She was killed in 1998. I mean, I didn't even particularly speak Russian very well, not much in 1998. So I wasn't really in a position to kind of walk around and quiz people on their feelings. As I said, I remember the headlines, I remember the news, but the significance of it really only kind of hit me many years later, as I think it. I mean, obviously everyone realized it was tragic and that it was a political murder, but the kind of the huge significance of it, I think, only started to sink in when Putin started to kind of reshape Russia in his own in the evil image.
Yeah. Let's stick with the KGB, with Putin's KGB background for a minute. So he comes into office in 2000. He's got this KGB background. It's not a secret, although people probably don't know exactly, what he was doing during his KGB career. But there's a charm offensive. There's this book, First Person, in which he's interviewed. He seems to say all the right things about Soviet history, for example, condemning the sending of Soviet tanks to Czechoslovakia, that kind of thing. And he manages to win over people like George W. Bush, Tony Blair. We even have the Queen speaking positively about him. I just saw a clip on the internet of Sean Penn talking about meeting Putin at some point, and how he was won over. Of course, Sean Penn is now a great advocate for Ukraine and a great friend of Zelensky. How did he win these people over? Why were they so open to him? Why was greater significance not attached to the KGB background?
I mean, I think they wanted to believe in him, so they were willing to kind of overlook his KGB background. But it wasn't just the KGB background they were willing to overlook. I mean, when Putin and his wife at the time, Ludmilla, were invited to Buckingham Palace in England, for example, to meet the Queen and be the guests of honor at a state dinner, this was during a period when civilians were being tortured and killed in Chechnya. I mean, a very damning report on the atrocities carried out by Russian soldiers came out around the same time as he was sitting there in his kind of dinner suit, and the Queen was calling him a great friend of Britain and hoping that relations would be fine. I mean, a cynic would say that for Britain, for example, was very interested in maintaining good relations with Putin, irrespective of everything, not just his KGB background, but I mean, it wasn't just his KGB background. I mean, he'd already closed down like the only independent television station in Russia, NTV, but he was still kind of invited to Britain, kind of portrayed as Britain's great friend. So, yeah, I mean, a cynic would say that the massive oil deal, which was carried out by BP in Russia around the time of his visit to Buckingham Palace, was essentially the reason. Well, this was the biggest investment by a foreign company in Russia in the post-Soviet period. So obviously business was quite important for Britain, and as not only in Britain and as not only at that time, it seemed that the government was willing to overlook the inconvenience of the torture and murder of civilians for business ties. Anna Politkovskaya, the Russian journalist at Novaya Gazeta, the opposition newspaper, said she asked Blair why he was so kind of friendly to Putin despite everything, and she wrote in her column at the time that Blair replied, "As Prime Minister, it's my job to like Mr. Putin," which I think kind of says it all.
It's his job because of business interests?
Well, it was his. Well, he didn't say that, but I guess we can infer that possibly. I mean, it was his job to maintain good ties with Russia. Yeah. I mean, there was an article in the Times newspaper at that period, actually, when the quote was something like, "While Blair hasn't entirely ignored kind of human rights abuses in Chechnya, British diplomats are kind of shocked by his willingness to overlook them and go kind of soft on Putin during private meetings." So, I mean, he was just, as the Russians say, he was raising the issue of human rights abuses kind of like for the tick, as the Russians say. It's like just for as a symbolic move, basically. I mean, it wasn't. There was nothing behind it, and I think probably Putin realized that.
Yeah. I guess the other thing was the desire to believe in the end of the Cold War. Like it was such a prize that, this had come to an end.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, especially if people like Bush, I imagine, who, I mean, it was kind of America's kind of victory in the Cold War, and so I guess that for Bush, when Bush famously looked into Putin's eyes and looked into his soul and saw a man that we can do business with, what was the alternative? The alternative was to say he's not a man we can do business with. Kind of the regime is back. We could have problems down the line, and that wasn't really the mood back then.
Yeah. Yeah, that would have been inconvenient. It would have been entirely repudiated, probably by great swathes of the public at the time.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. Let's talk about the early stages of Putin's presidency. One of the more intriguing sources you had in Moscow was Gleb Pavlovsky, who was a former Soviet dissident who had avoided prison by publicly renouncing his anti-Kremlin position, later became an advisor to Putin in his first term. He told you quite a lot about the building of Putinism, particularly about how Putin's spin doctors built up the idea of national dependency on Putin, the idea that there was no alternative to his rule, kept him away from scandals like the Kursk disaster. So tell us what you learned from Pavlovsky.
Yeah, well, Gleb Pavlovsky was possibly one of the most interesting people to speak to in Russia about Putin's rule, because he was there. I mean, he was there in the early years. He helped build it. He was very instrumental, and he died in 2023, almost a year to the day. I think that Putin, his dark creation, unleashed the war in Ukraine. But yeah, his idea, as he told me, the idea of the team that he was a part of that brought Putin to power was that they wanted to have this kind of like strong leader, because Russians needed to kind of recover from the traumas of the 1990s, which was admittedly a very dramatic, chaotic period in Russia, lots of poverty, crime, etc., etc. They thought that kind of an iron fist type figure who decided everything would allow the Russian nation to kind of heal and revive. I mean, I'm not entirely sure I agree with the logic behind that, but that's.
I mean, it sounds nuts when you paraphrase it, doesn't it?
Well, yeah, but I mean, he seemed quite. That was their idea, yeah. That they introduced kind of the idea and the policy that Putin decided everything. So if you had a problem, you had to go to the Kremlin. You couldn't. There was no other way you could decide it. And then, I mean, in hindsight, obviously, knowing what we know now about Putin, it's just ammunition for his insanity, which built up over the years. I mean, it was probably the beginning, right? So, I mean, now he's just locked in an echo chamber of state media and loyal officials telling him how wonderful he is, how great he is, how Russia would collapse without him. But I mean, arguably, it started in the early 2000s when the policy was that you decide everything. We can't do it. No one can do anything without you. But Pavlovsky was eventually fired from the Kremlin because he wanted Dmitry Medvedev, to stand for a second term, As you know, Putin stepped down as president in 2008, handed over the presidency to Dmitry Medvedev, who was this kind of like youngish, relatively young lawyer, kind of seen as very liberal, walking around with like his iPhone all the time, hanging out with, I think of Steve Jobs in Silicon Valley, and Pavlovsky wanted Medvedev to run for a second term. Putin at this point was prime minister. He shifted to the post of prime minister so that he could avoid term limits, because the Russian constitution said you could serve two consecutive terms, but it didn't say anything about terms after this. So like,
yes, the tandem strategy. Yeah.
And Pavlovsky wanted Medvedev to run again. Putin wasn't having it, and Medvedev wasn't. I mean, Medvedev admitted essentially that he'd like to stand again. He'd like to stand for a second term, but he wasn't allowed to. There's a famous interview he gave with the Financial Times, and he said it was something like, sometimes a person would like to do something, but other people won't allow him to do it, which was the president saying, basically admitting that he wasn't allowed to stand for a second term, which was quite sad, and possibly one of the reasons why Medvedev transformed into the kind of foul-mouthed genocidal maniac that we see today. Who knows?
What were those years? What were those years like for you? The Medvedev years.
The Medvedev years were. I mean, in hindsight, they were good. There was lots of kind of optimism around. This was the period when TV Rain, TV Dozhd, opened their studio in the center of Moscow, and their slogan was the optimistic channel. And no one, I mean, it seemed to kind of capture the idea that Russia was, despite everything, but that Russia was moving forward. I mean, one of the things I remember, there's this kind of law in Russia that everyone has to be registered in the flat that they live in, and it's very bureaucratic, and it's like a Soviet hangover. And I remember Medvedev coming out and saying, like, why do we even need this? It's like, it's not the Soviet Union anymore. Let's get rid of it. And I thought, wow, that would just be really symbolic if the registration law was scrapped, but obviously it never was. Sorry.
would have made traveling to Russia for short stints to work a lot easier. Yeah,
of course. I mean, it was just one of many things. But that was, I mean, in hindsight, again, Medvedev's kind of role was just a lot of empty words and posing, and nothing actually changed, or nothing of significance actually changed. I mean, one of the only, I mean, people joke that one of the only things Medvedev actually did during his time as office was to extend the presidential term limits from 4 years to 6 years, which meant that when Putin came back, he had another 6 years in office before he had to kind of rig the next election. But yeah, I mean, it was an interesting period. Russia seemed to be developing in some way. There was. I mean, for myself personally, I even worked at Irrationality, which is a Russian news agency, which dated from the Soviet period, and I became their first English language correspondent in 2010 until 2012, late 2012. But this was a period that coincided with the biggest protests in Russia of the Putin era over vote rigging that benefited his party at the December 2011 elections. And I was working for this kind of what was a state news agency, but there was no censorship at all, because Medvedev's policy was kind of like to modernize Russia, and part of this was to turn RIA Novosti into this kind of like Reuters-style news agency. But I mean, to be honest, Reuters was objective, right? But I was just allowed to do anything. I mean, I would write columns just openly making fun of Putin. I remember once when he cried, or appeared to cry, after his re-election in 2012, and there were tears in his eyes. I opened the column with kind of, I'm fed up of writing the word Putin for the entirety of this column. I'm going to call him he who sobs with joy. And then I wrote the entire column, because I mean, they were kind enough to give me a weekly column as well. And at the end, I wrote, so now he who sobs with joy will be in power for another 6 years. That's a really long time, even for the most democratic, kindest, kind of fairest leader in the planet. I'm not sure who it is, but it's definitely not he who sobs with joy. And they just ran it, like, without question, like nothing at all. I mean, that kind of stuff would get you put in prison for quite a long time now, I imagine, in Russia, if, of course, they published it, which they wouldn't. But you get my point.
You mentioned something about that RIA Novosti experiment being about courting foreign investors, being able to demonstrate that there was a free press.
Well, no one knows, really. I mean, it's one of the mysteries. I mean, there was like 18 months, 2 years, where certainly the English language, the side of it, was just allowed kind of unprecedented freedom. I mean, and a colleague of mine wrote, and it was published again by this is a state news agency, and a colleague of mine there wrote about the Young Guard, which is a pro-Putin youth movement. He wrote how he'd like to see them all packed into a bus and thrown off the bridge into the Moscow River, and they just published it. And it's like, okay, so I don't really know what was going on there. I mean, it could be as I suspect.
That's quite extreme as well.
Well, yeah,
Yeah.
but they published it as well. It was just like, without question, no one was even. I mean, at the time, we didn't really know how many people were reading our stuff because it was kind of early days of social media, etc. But then, when it was closed down, eventually, it turned out RIA Novosti was doing a good job. A lot of people were kind of sad to see it go. But yeah, it was an interesting experience, to say the least.
You must around that time have run into some of the well-paid young Brits who were turning up in Moscow to work for like RT and Kremlin-funded media. Did you run into any of those people?
Not really. I didn't really hang out with them. A couple, but nothing of kind of significance.
Right. I was just going to ask what you made of them, like their motives, like what kind of people they were.
Well, I mean, the few I met. I mean, this was around again 2010, so Russia Today hadn't yet kind of transformed into the kind of insane kind of propaganda machine that it is today. I mean, when Russia Today started, it was basically, it was kind of like, come to Russia, we have bears, that kind of thing. You know? And there was, I mean, then it started to get very dark. Basically after the war in Georgia, it started to get darker and darker. But still, by 2010, it wasn't totally insane. I mean, it switched in 2014, really, when Russia annexed Ukraine. As far as I remember. As far as I remember, I mean, I may have
right. Let's get into that inflection point where stuff starts to get mental.
Mm-hmm. It's a very good word, mental, as well, because I mean, some of the things that you kind of hear and see in Russia, I mean, they kind of defy analysis. Well, I heard and saw, well, even now. But I mean, they kind of defy analysis. I mean, really. So I mean, I think madness, insanity, kind of mental is a very good description of what exactly was happening. I mean, you could say that the propagandists, people doing the propaganda, were just cynical. But even so, I mean, I think that kind of like level of cynicism is almost pathological and in itself a form of insanity. And I think lots of them actually genuinely believe the kind of hatred and lies that they're kind of spouting now.
Well, the major theme of the book, arguably, is the power of propaganda, especially since 2014, so around the time of Sochi Olympics, annexation of Crimea. So tell us about that time and what you saw changing, maybe in connection with those events.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, the annexation of Crimea and Russia's military campaign in eastern Ukraine, the Donbass, in 2014 was definitely a turning point in modern Russian history. Things very quickly got very dark. I mean, again, they hadn't been ideal before, but we started to see kind of different levels of political repression, different levels of propaganda. This is around the time when state television, Dmitry Kiselyov, for example, came out and boasted that Russia was the only country in the world able to turn the United States into radioactive ash. There was also there was a television channel called NTV, which would just broadcast kind of unbelievable things. I mean, they would interview pro-Kremlin figures, not officials, but kind of no, they interviewed what they called an insurgent in eastern Ukraine who issued on air a death threat to a Russian opposition figure, and his final line was, "A death will come for you, and death will look like this." Poked his fingers into the camera, like into the eyes of the person he was threatening. I mean, it just ran. So yeah, and then 2015, for example, Boris Nemtsov, the opposition leader, was killed, shot dead, shot close to Red Square, just before a planned a march that he'd been planning against Russia's actions in Ukraine. And we also saw the emergence of just bizarre anti-Western groups, such as the Night Wolves, the motorcycle gang, who fanatically kind of pro-Putin and anti-Ukraine, and they had an anti-Maidan, as in a reference to the Ukrainian Revolution of 2014, anti-Maidan march in central Moscow just before Nemtsov was killed, which was just a collection of kind of some of the weirdest and most kind of disturbing pro-Kremlin figures there were. It was like the Night Wolves, people who claimed to be Cossacks with leather whips. I mean, just essentially all the Kremlin's nutters hanging out in central Moscow.
Claim to be Cossacks.
Well,
Tell me about that.
Well, I mean,
fake Cossacks.
Well, yeah, I mean,
how do you find a Cossack? Who's a real Cossack and who's a fake Kremlin Cossack?
Well, I mean, exactly. I mean, I could say I'm a Cossack, right? Who's gonna check? So, yeah, I mean, I spoke to Cossacks who said, I remember going to Voronezh region in Russia and meeting Cossacks who were very proud of their kind of Cossack history in their family, going back generations, who were fighting against the Kremlin-backed nickel project, and they were telling me about how the Kremlin Cossacks weren't real Cossacks because they had no background. I mean, it's quite. So
it's got the historical resonance from the Tsarist era, where I guess Cossacks with whips were deployed against any kind of demonstration, revolutionary tendency.
Yeah, but the Cossacks also rebelled as well. So I mean,
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. You mentioned Kiselyov. Will you describe how certain TV pundits like Vladimir Kiselyov, like some of the most extreme pro-Kremlin, anti-Ukraine TV pundits, had an earlier incarnation as like mild pro-Ukrainian figures? Tell us about that.
Well, yeah, I mean, the prime example is Dmitry Kiselyov, who actually worked in Ukraine in the early 2000s. Apparently, he worked at a television station in Kiev, and apparently he used to begin meetings with "Everything we are doing is for the good of Ukraine." And he gave an interview to Ukrainian television where he was saying he started to feel Ukrainian, and that people here really love their country, which is something I can't say about Russia. And now he's part of a kind of a Kremlin propaganda machine, which regularly calls for the destruction of Kiev, for denies Ukraine's existence as a kind of independent country. But he says it's because of the 2004 Orange Revolution, which is a kind of like steered Ukraine away from its natural links, as he put it, with Russia. So, I mean, you can believe it or not. I don't know. I spoke to some of his colleagues who just said that he's just cynical and just a mercenary. One of his former colleagues said that, told me that he's been tasked now with stirring up hatred of Ukraine. But if he was tasked, like next year, for example, with telling Russians how wonderful Ukrainians were and how we've always been friends, kind of thing, he would do it with just no hesitation. It's unimportant. The message isn't important for him. It's the money. Was the idea, which I think is a very important, actually, kind of point, because while kind of propaganda is so powerful in Russia, and which is kind of very sad and depressing, and would seem not to indicate any kind of bright future or even kind of semi hopeful future for Russia. I mean, you could argue that because because propaganda is so powerful, that if, for example, pro-democracy kind of the pro-democracy opposition takes power in Russia, which, for the record, I don't think they will in the foreseeable future. But if they did, I think that they would also be able to use the kind of the power of state television and the kind of the influence of the machine that kind of Putin has built up, and the kind of willingness of many Russians to believe what they hear from the screen, even if they don't directly hear it themselves. Yeah? I mean, the message just floats in the air. Yes, I mean, it's quite common to hear Russians say, "I never watch state television," and just repeat what state television has been saying that week, because it literally is everywhere. Yeah, I mean, it's like in social media, it's on radio, it's in the newspapers. But getting back to my point, I think that if kind of a pro-democracy opposition comes to power, they would use this mighty kind of strength of propaganda to tell Russians that kind of Putin was evil, he misled you all, he took us into a catastrophic war in Ukraine, and I think within like 6 months, a year, I think Putin would be the most reviled person in Russia. I mean, I think it's that strong. So I mean, that's kind of that's one admittedly very kind of remote possibility right now. I think it's a very good illustration of how kind of simple it would be to change the mindsets of an entire nation.
There's something
I mean, it happened before, right? After the collapse of the Soviet Union. Yeah? I mean, people who spend their whole lives growing up in total worship. Lenin and Marx were certainly told that the entire system they'd grown up with, or that they'd known all their lives, was a lie, essentially. Yeah. So why couldn't it happen again?
Yeah, there's something deeply disconcerting about the idea of people with such little in the way of internal political life. Like, to start with Kiselyov, like there's something disconcertingly hollow. And yes, we accept that there are certain people with abnormal psychology, maybe they're psychopaths, something like that. But when you see it spread across a population and you see that kind of extreme malleability in the face of powerful media, it's like, it's uncanny. I think that's the word for it. It's uncanny.
Well, I mean, obviously it's tempting to suggest it doesn't just apply to Russia, right? I mean,
that's true, yeah.
Since the book came out, I've had kind of quite a few Americans saying, wow, it says exactly what's happening here with Trump. The kind of descent into madness, which I'm not entirely sure I agree with, but because obviously there's dissenting media in America right now anyway. But I think the power of the media to kind of shape a nation's mindset in a not entirely positive way is kind of applies to every single country. You know, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I often think.
Yeah, we see.
I don't think it's anything to do with the. I'm not sure it has anything essentially to do with the Russians themselves.
No.
I mean, I've had this discussion with British people who say, like, how can the Russians believe like all these lies? Yeah, I mean, without excusing them for a second, yeah, without justifying it. I mean, anyone who believes the Kremlin lies. I mean, I wouldn't justify them at all. And to be honest, I kind of hate them, like, on a personal level. The people I used to know, but I often think, for example, if Britain had the same kind of level of if there was the same level of control in Britain as there is in Russia, and for years we were told that, for example, the French are evil, that they're Nazis, that they're a threat to our way of life, and there were very few dissenting views, and the people who said, wait, I mean, the French are actually okay, who were like locked up, killed, whatever, I don't know, what would happen?
That's a very like Orwellian idea, like.
Well, exactly, yeah.
Like it could happen here, like just. If we transplant the system to London, and we see how Londoners react. That's the whole kind of premise of 1984.
Well, yeah, exactly. I mean, but obviously, the fact that we have had dissent, that we have had a kind of fairly vibrant kind of media landscape for the last how many decades, you would hope that even if even if Britain was taken over by like this dictatorship and we started pumping out anti-French propaganda, that it wouldn't take hold immediately. I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I mean, the sheer, like, it's all the wealth of the nation. I mean, a great tranche of the wealth of the nation is being poured into one message that's repeated across multiple different media outlets. So it kind of creates, maybe on an unconscious level, the illusion that people are hearing this information from multiple different sources, but they're state-funded sources.
I mean, it's like to kind of it's like the image or the idea that seems to be very kind of popular in the world right now, that like London is this like extremely dangerous hellhole where you can't walk without, where it's impossible for women to walk the streets at night, where it's just basically this dystopian kind of like urban hell.
Yeah, I've seen that stuff. Yeah.
I mean, it's a surprising amount of people believe it. Yeah. I mean, London has its problems, yeah, but it's not on the level that you see on kind of on social media, and especially in Hungary, they seem to believe it. Well, a lot of people in Hungary, I found recently.
I hear the times are a change in Hungary, so let's hope for more accurate portrayals of our town. Yeah. So one of the really interesting aspects of your book is your willingness to look at irrational trends or irrational thought in political life. So before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, it was possible, even common, to hear all kinds of really rational-sounding explanations for why Putin wouldn't initiate a major confrontation with the West. It was usually to do with Russian oligarchs having massive investments in London, or it was to do with Putin's dependency on economic ties to Germany and the EU. These were the kind of like Putin is just a kleptocrat arguments that didn't consider ideology. They didn't consider the role of the irrational in international relations. And in your book, you've got a couple of characters, both in different ways from the realm of the irrational. So one was the clownish extreme nationalist Vladimir Zhirinovsky. Another was Alexander Gabashev, an anti-Putin shaman from Siberia. And they both, in their ways, predicted the war in Ukraine. Tell us about those characters.
Yeah, I mean, Zhirinovsky, I mean, I describe him in the book as a madman for hire, and he was essentially gave voice to the kind of extreme nationalist sentiments in Russia for the Kremlin. Yes, it was like that would allow these people who genuinely wanted to go to war with the West, allowed them to kind of blow off steam by voting for Zhirinovsky every 4 or 6 years, or for his party, the LDPR. But I mean, Zhirinovsky was. I mean, I imagine a lot of people watching this will know who Zhirinovsky was. But I mean, he would just regularly call for Russia to drop nuclear weapons on countries that he considered to be Russia's enemies: the Baltic states, Britain, Ukraine. I mean, not that long before, a few years before the war actually started, he called for the Kremlin to drop a small nuclear bomb on the Ukrainian president's residence. It was like, not a big one, just a small one. Won't be much radiation. But yeah, and he was head of the third biggest party in Russia. And so yeah, getting back to your point, he predicted that the war would begin. Or no, he predicted that that the world would see Russia's might again in February 2022, and this will not be a peaceful year. But no one really paid attention at the time, because I mean, Zhirinovsky would just rant. I mean, he probably ranted at home in his sleep. You know, he was just spouting out just insane stuff all the time. So not many people paid attention to it, and but then as Russian troops massed on the border with Ukraine in 2022. the video of him saying this in the State Duma kind of went viral. And actually, the first time I found out about it was, I think it was February the 22nd, 2022. So it's just 2 days before the full-scale invasion, when I was driving around Russia's border with Ukraine, and we were kind of searching for Russian tanks at night, and we got a taxi, just ordered a taxi, and the guy turned up. He was telling us about it, and we hadn't even heard about it. So we're just driving around. This guy's just playing this clip of Zhirinovsky saying how like Russia's going to show the world this year. But I mean, it's quite possible that Zhirinovsky knew something. We'll never know because he died, also in 2022, of complications from coronavirus. But it's entirely plausible that someone in the security services or some kind of military source had told him what the plan was. I mean, we don't know. I mean, Putin didn't tell many people, it seems, what he was going to do. So did Zhirinovsky know? Did he hear a whisper? We'll never know. And then the shaman, from Yakutsk, the coldest city in the world, when I went to visit him a few years, 2 or 3 years before the start of the full-scale invasion. He was sitting there in his kind of house on the outskirts of frozen Yakutsk. It was like minus 43 outside, and then the whole place is blanketed in snow. And he's sitting there with his kind of ceremonial markings all over his face and his long sword. And he said to me, like, Putin is a demon. He hides his horns. If he isn't stopped, he'll start a huge war, and only the cockroaches will survive. So far, it hasn't come to that, of course, but I mean, the huge war part did come true. Again, I have no insight into how he knew. I mean, a lot of people were kind of predicting that something bad was going to happen under Putin anyway. I mean, that he was leading Russia towards catastrophe.
Well, I mean, we do have a historical record of dictators consolidating power and driving their country off a cliff. It's not like it's never happened before.
Well, yeah. Yeah.
You did quite a lot of reporting on Gabyshev. Tell us more about him. What was he like? What did you make of him?
Well, as I was saying, I was sitting with him in Yakutsk in his house. He had this huge kind of ceremonial sword about the size of his arm. But I remember thinking afterwards that I actually felt kind of safer sitting next to him than sitting next to Zhirinovsky, who's like this high-profile politician. Because I mean, they were both I'd say Zhirinovsky was pathologically, was nuts, yeah. And the shaman was, he was eccentric. I didn't see that he was dangerous. But obviously, there are levels of acceptable, the levels of kind of how eccentric you could be in Russia very much depend on what your stance is towards Putin, right? So nothing ever happened to Zhirinovsky, even though he kind of threatened. He told one of his most notorious moments, he ordered his aides to rape a pregnant journalist who asked him a question that he didn't like He didn't like this question. He said, rape her. And obviously they didn't, because it was like a press conference, but she was in shock and she had to go to hospital and she was pregnant and nothing ever happened. Whereas the shaman decided to march towards Moscow and to exorcise the demon that is Putin. And I remember asking, do you mean exorcise the demon from Putin? And he's like, no, exorcise the demon that is Putin. So he was like, Putin is this demon, and he has to be kind of exorcised, basically. So yeah, he started to walk towards Moscow, where his plan was to turn up at the gates of the Kremlin, carry out a magical ritual that would banish Putin from this world, or at least the demon Putin. But the Kremlin wasn't having that, right? So they sent security services, arrested him, and
they treated him like a real threat.
Well, yeah, essentially, yeah,
which is something that would not happen, let's say, in Britain.
Well,
if a shaman wanted to exercise the prime minister, they'd probably be told, go right ahead, don't make a mess on Parliament Square.
Yeah,
but have at it. But you're right that there's in Russia, the occult is credited in a way that it isn't elsewhere.
Yeah, I mean, there was a well-known Russian poet who said at the time that, of course, they arrested him because they all believe in this stuff themselves. They all believe in the occult. They all believe in shamans. And what if this guy had more powerful connections than their shamans? Yeah. So, I mean, there are kind of fairly credible rumors, reports that Putin himself visits shamans inside Russia, consults with them. I don't know how true that is, but so I mean, I researched Russia's kind of fascination with the occult for a while, and so many kind of self-claimed kind of witches and psychics, etc., etc. They all had these stories about Kremlin officials or government officials coming to consult with them. One told me when she had her office like quite close to the Kremlin, she was like, they come at night so no one can see them. Another one told me whenever Russia has high-level negotiations, they always bring a psychic. I mean, obviously I have no proof, but so many people told me these stories that you start to think that there's something behind it. I mean, there actually is something behind it. We know for a fact that one of the more bizarre kind of stories connected with the paranormal, let's say, in Russia is Putin and other high-level officials in Russia have been repeating for years that Madeleine Albright thought it was wrong that Russia owned Siberia. Putin often alludes to it. He's like, as we know, like Western officials have always said it's wrong that all of Siberia's resources belong to Russia and they want to take it from us. And it's kind of been repeated in Russian media, repeated by other officials close to the Kremlin and government officials. But there's no record that Albright actually said it. Madeleine Albright never said it, as far as we can tell. So eventually it emerged that the claim that Madeleine Albright thought it was unfair that Russia owned Siberia came from an interview with a member of a mind-reading team which had been employed in the Yeltsin era. And they had stared at a photograph of Madeleine Albright to try and find out what she was thinking, and concluded that she was thinking, it's wrong that Russia owns Siberia. And then it got to Putin, and now he just kind of repeats it as an aside.
Yeah. These guys should be checking their sources more carefully.
Well, yeah. I mean, or maybe not. I mean, it's quite convenient for Putin to be able to say that, I guess. So.
Yeah. I mean, maybe I should mention that we first met in Moscow because I'd come across your book, Resurrections for Rubles, which was about the influence of various, let's say, non-rational characters in Russian life. I was working on the book about Soviet atheism, so I was interested in, topics related to belief.
Yeah, that was just an ebook, so I mean, it never got published officially. But if anyone's listening and wants to commission it, so.
Yeah, go get it. Go get the ebook on Kindle. So let's move on. So one of the big Orwellian themes in your book is torture. So there's the case, for example, of Ildar Dadin, a Russian protester who was tortured in a prison camp after being repeatedly detained at protests. He even cites his reading of 1984 in his conversations with you. He also recounts, I think, being forced to repeat the phrase, Putin is the president of Russia.
Putin is our president, yeah.
Putin is our president, yeah. As a kind of incantation. You cite research from the Levada Center in 2019 suggesting that 1 in 10 Russians had experienced some form of torture from the authorities. And then you've got accounts of torture in Russian-occupied parts of Ukraine, where people living near certain Russian facilities can't sleep for all the screams that they're hearing. So tell me about torture in Russian society and also as a tool of occupation in Ukraine.
Yeah, I mean, Dadin's case was one of the gained a lot of attention. Mainly due to his wife. After he was arrested, she told me she received a letter from him detailing the torture. I mean, quite horrific stuff. And her dilemma was
go into detail. I mean,
he was.
Should hear it.
He was beaten, hung up by his arms, forced to say it, to shout, "Putin's our president." Um, and she had this kind of dilemma, like, do I say anything? Do I publish the letter? If I publish the letter and they find out, and there's no, it doesn't have any effect, he'll get beaten even more, but maybe like he'll get freed. And so she took the risk, and he was eventually released, which came to the surprise of a lot of people. No one really knows why. That this kind of campaign was effective. But I met him after he was released, and he was stuttering. He'd been through kind of hell, and as you said, he was cited kind of Orwell. You remember the part when Winston is so terrified that he's willing to have the horrors or the torture that he's about to face with the rats inflicted not upon him but upon Julia. He says, like, do it to her, and he told me, yeah. I realized that was like very close to that moment, and that they essentially they'd broken me, and that's what it's all about. I mean, it's about, well, that's not only what it's about, but I mean, obviously when it comes to people who are opposed to the Kremlin, I mean, it's about breaking them, right? I mean, they take joy in breaking them, but it's also just that in Russia, these people with sadistic tendencies know that it's kind of very unlikely they will face any recrimination, that they will face any payback, and especially in Ukraine, right? Because I mean, again, they're in occupied Ukraine, for example, in Kherson, where I was, people were telling me stories of how they were beaten. I've just heard horrific stories.
I think it's
a lot of people
important for people to know the details.
Yeah, I mean, like being wrapped up in kind of in cellophane, beaten, and used as human furniture. I mean, people have been raped. Men have had truncheons. I mean, people don't want to go into detail, right, when you talk to them, because it's not something a lot of people feel kind of forced to engage in sexual. Men have been forced to engage in sexual acts with each other, for example, by Russian guards. But it's, I mean, these are the same people who were carrying out torture in Russia, right? But if in Russia, maybe they thought back of their minds there was a very, very, very small chance, admittedly, that they would face some kind of prosecution. In Ukraine, they know they just have a free hand; they can do what they want. No one is going to say anything to them, and they can just live out their sickest fantasies, and that's essentially what they're doing. So, I mean, they're torturing them, because they're Ukrainians, but also because they just enjoy torturing people. The Kremlin doesn't see anything wrong with it. It seems to kind of, as far as we can tell, it seems to believe that torture is a way to kind of like break the Ukrainians, break the spirit, especially of the soldiers who have been held inside Russia.
Yeah, I saw a headline about
and the civilians. I mean, a lot of the attention is on the Ukrainian soldiers who have been tortured, but Ukrainian civilians are tortured just as badly and just as mercilessly. And it's, while there are kind of often exchanges that free Ukrainian prisoners of war, it's far less common for Ukrainian civilians to be released from Russia in these exchanges. So in many cases, these are kind of like the forgotten victims. Not forgotten by Ukraine, but they have fewer chances to get out. So
yeah, I saw a headline today. Dmitry Muratov, the editor of Novaya Gazeta, had said something about how cruelty has become an expression of patriotism in Russia, or is like construed as an expression of patriotism now. So it's like the crueler you can be, the more you're proving your loyalty to the system.
Yeah, I mean, Putin's entire system is just based on violence, based on repression, and I mean, essentially, that's one of the issues that Russia will have to deal with if it is going to kind of, transform into a normal society. how do you overcome this kind of acceptance of violence? How do you overcome this kind of culture of torture that's been built up over so many years, and the authorities have turned a blind eye to? I don't know. That's kind of one of the things. One of the things that makes me think there's kind of one of the many things that makes me feel not particularly optimistic about Russia's future is that just violence has just become so deeply ingrained into society.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, one thing I noticed about your book is, well, there's a very strong sense of loss. You lived in you lived in Russia for 25 years, I guess most of that in Moscow. So it had become your city. You have decades of memories there. You started a family there. That's all wrenched away when you have to leave. Then you're catapulted into being a war correspondent, which I guess you hadn't been before. But you make a few references in the book to like the notion of going back, one day. That would presumably be after Putin's gone, after there's been some kind of change of regime. What would need to change there for you to go back? What if you want to envision the day that you are able to go back? What's changed?
Well, I mean, it kind of basically depends on how I go back, right? I mean, to go back and live right now, I mean, I think I'd have problems with it. I mean, even if Putin is gone, right? I don't know. I mean, in my opinion, this kind of changes every day, to be honest. I often think about, like, under what circumstances I could go back and live there again, like, permanently. A reporting trip, I mean, I'd be happy to go for reporting trips. But to live there again, I think, I mean, it will never be the same as it was, right? Simply because of what happened in Ukraine. I mean, just a lot of time I'd be thinking about people who I'm talking to, like, did you support this? Did your family members fight? Did you cheer when kind of like Ukrainian cities were being bombed? That's on a kind of like personal day-to-day level. Obviously, as a reporter, I would write about that. Yeah. So I mean, that wouldn't be a reason not to report from that. I wouldn't have any kind of like. I wouldn't feel like I couldn't possibly go there and report on these people, because I mean, Russia before the full-scale invasion wasn't an ideal society, right? There was a lot of violence, there was corruption. Yeah. I mean, so, yeah, I mean, there's kind of the darkness that took over Russia from the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and arguably before it. I think kind of would make it, I don't know, at this point I think I'd feel kind of uncomfortable about living permanently in Moscow again, and I don't think it's something right now I'd want to do. If Putin dies, right, and or is removed from power in whatever way, obviously it would be incredibly interesting and useful to go back and report on the changes. And I think that changes could come to Russia. I don't think positive changes, right? I mean, I think they could come to Russia. It's not something I'm particularly optimistic about right now. I mean, there are lots of Russian opposition members. They kind of say that dictatorships always fall, that democracy always wins out, but does it? I mean, it hasn't happened in North Korea, it hasn't happened in China, I mean, it hasn't happened in Iran, right? So, I mean, I think that's kind of a little bit naively optimistic. But to say 100% that Russia will never transform is also wrong, yeah, because it's a very unpredictable place. So, I think it's kind of would be also, on the other hand, naive to rule out positive changes in Russia. I just don't see them happening. I mean, in my lifetime, I don't know. I mean, I'd like to go back. I'd like to go back to Russia at one point, because, as I say, I spent 25 years there, and I miss it, despite everything. But I don't know. I mean, it's all very, very. I mean, I think until at least the war ends, we're not going to really have any clarity on the future of Russia.
Yeah.
And it doesn't seem as if the war is going to end. I mean, think Putin's just willing to go on. I mean, it's his kind of, I don't know. I mean, that's the thing about Putin. Yeah, he's always like, "I love Russia. We all love Russia." But like, how can you love your country and send so many of your people to die in like a senseless war? Doesn't seem like. Well, I mean, maybe he has a very strange idea of love, but it doesn't seem like love to me.
Sounds like a good title for a book, Putin's Strange Idea of Love.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, if it is his idea of love, it's very warped, as many things, as are most things in Vladimir Putin's head. So that would come to no surprise. It's come as no surprise.
Yeah. All right. Well, that sounds like a good place to leave it, Mark. So the book is The Descent, Witnessing Russia's Spiral into Madness Under Putin. You can find Mark in the Times and Sunday Times. He's on X at Marc Bennetts 1. You can find me at theorwellians.substack.com, X, Roland E. Brown, Instagram at Roland Elliott Brown. Long-form articles in New Lines magazine. Please support the channel by using the donate link in the show notes to subscribe or subscribe to the Orwellian Substack. Thanks very much, Mark.
No problem. Thanks. Bye.
Thanks.